Anthony James Hall is full professor of globalization studies at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta, Canada. This year, 2014, marks Professor Hall's 25th anniversary of teaching at this progressive school of higher learning. Lethbridge is situated on the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, 40 miles north of the Canadian-U.S. border. The River of Napi, the Blackfoot Indian term for Old Man, flows through this university town. Dr. Hall began his professorial work in 1982. A prolific author of books and articles, his largest literary project is a 2-volume set entitled The Bowl with One Spoon. The award-winning The American Empire in the Fourth World is the first of the set, a global history addressing the relationship between colonization, decolonization, and capitalism. His recent omnograph, Earth into Property, was chosen by The Independent in the United Kingdom as one of the best history books of 2010. In the introduction to Earth into Property, Professor Hall traces the origins of many of his scholarly perspectives back to his African motorcycle safari in 1971. The author begins the narrative with his motorcycle memoirs. In it, he highlights his circumnavigation of the snow-covered Ruwenzori Mountains while traveling on his single-cylinder BSA 250 motorcycle. In the midst of Africa's Great Lakes region, the snow-covered Ruwenzoris are the source of both the Nile and Congo rivers. Throughout his motorcycle safari, the future Professor Hall was presented with stark demonstrations of connections that link the changing structures of empire with the predicaments of many indigenous peoples. His face-to-face encounters with those African people, caught in the grips of these antagonisms, would be instrumental in shaping the great themes of Professor Hall's future academic work. The insights he gained caused him to reevaluate the origins and nature of his own North American society. In the Americas, as well as in Africa, indigenous peoples have suffered the ruthless onslaught of colonization.
When I arrived at the Ruwenzori Mountains in 1970, Idi Amin had just seized power in Uganda. Another military dictator, Joseph Mobutu, was consolidating control over the Congo. Both men had been put in power by foreign corporations in North America and Europe, seeking to retain control over Africa's great natural resource wealth. These corporations worked through their captive governments, whose goal was to control the process of decolonization. The shape of things to come was signaled by the Cold War decision of the U.S. and Belgian governments to assassinate Congo's first elected president. The murder of President Patrice Lumumba, a beloved leader of the Pan-African movement, violated the very first act of sovereign independence by the Congolese people. Although I did not realize it at the time, the iconographic Che Guevara had intervened militarily in the same region of the Congo I visited in 1971. In Earth into Property, I drew a connection between my own motorcycle memoirs and Che's motorcycle diaries. In Motorcycle Diaries, Che describes his own coming-of-age tour in Latin America. Both exploratory narratives are animated by premonitions of the human liberation to come in a world freed of the tyrannies of empire and inequity.
In the 20 years between 1982 and 2002, Professor Hall distinguished himself demonstrating academic expertise in the history and politics of the ongoing colonization of indigenous peoples in the Americas. During this period, Aboriginal issues moved to the forefront of national controversy in Canada. Drawing on his academic work, Professor Hall assisted First Nations people in a number of land disputes, blockades, and court cases. He gave expert testimony to parliamentary committees and was published widely in scholarly journals and mainstream media. He worked with OG Cree parliamentarian Elijah Harper and other Aboriginal leaders to bring forward legal arguments in an era when Great Britain gave to Canada the authority to reshape the constitutional architecture of Canadian governance. In the course of this work, Professor Hall developed an important collaboration with the Mohawk activist Splitting the Sky a persecuted veteran of the violent debacle that took place at Attica Prison in Upper New York State. In 1995, the Attica brother and leader of the American Indian movement became a primary figure in one of Canada's modern-day Indian wars. In an effort to quell the Aboriginal resistance movement near Gustafson Lake, British Columbia, the Canadian government deployed Special Forces units, armored personnel carriers, landmines, and fired at least 70,000 rounds of live ammunition at the Aboriginal protest camp. The Gustafson Lake Indian War led to an historic ruling in a U.S. court where the judge accepted much of Professor Hall's expert testimony. As a result, the contested issue of Indian title to the lands of British Columbia was internationalized. Splitting the Sky led Professor Hall to much evidence that the government's official interpretation of 9/11 is untrue. As a result, Professor Hall joined Dr. Kevin Barrett first on his Truth Jihad radio show and then on a public platform in Edmonton, Alberta. In 2009, former U.S. President George W. Bush came to Calgary to give a speech. By that time, Splitting the Sky and his colleagues had exhausted all attempts to pressure the Canadian government to enforce its law against credibly accused war criminals. Consequently, Splitting the Sky attempted a citizen's arrest of Bush. This history of collaboration became an integral factor in Professor Hall's transition from Native American studies to globalization studies.
My focus on the colonial oppression of indigenous peoples continues to draw me into the deepening holocaust of unjust relations between the Jewish state of Israel and the Palestinian people. Increasingly, this genocidal crisis seems intertwined with the 9/11 debacle, as the evidence continues to mount that the controlled demolition of the 3 World Trade Center buildings was organized by Israeli agents intent on demonizing the Jewish state's Arab and Persian enemies. The startling implications of this thesis hit home especially hard in Canada, a country where Prime Minister Stephen Harper rose to power on the wave of negative energy generated by the lies and crimes of 9/11. Prime Minister Harper's obsession to become Israel's #1 ally has become especially difficult to accept after the world witnessed the Netanyahu government's ruthless assault on Gaza during the summer of 2014. I'm a Canadian and I'm very confused by my own federal government. The Canadian Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, has made it clear he sees himself as Israel's #1 ally, as Israel's best friend. And of course, he's speaking on behalf of the government of Canada. Now, in the recent invasion of Gaza by Israel, the meaning of this became clear. He stated in the Knesset that Canada would not criticize Israel publicly, no matter what it does. And so there was no criticism from the government of Canada as over 2,000 mostly civilian Palestinians, including many children, were murdered in this invasion of the Gaza concentration camp. Now, that's just the beginning of the story, because the 2 main opposition parties in Canada, the Liberal Party, led by Justin Trudeau, whose father used to be Prime Minister of Canada, and the NDP party, the Social Democratic Party, the more left-leaning party, led by Tom Mulcair. Both these leaders took the same position, mirrored the position of Stephen Harper when it came to the question of Palestine-Israel. So we can see that our parliamentary democracy is a bit of a farce. It's been hollowed out. It's defunct. Parliamentary democracy in Canada is not working when it comes to fundamental issues of war and peace, life and death.